Several years ago now, somebody at one of my bosses at Wessex said to me, Phil, would you like to do a little writing up job? I said, well, what is it? Well, this is some excavations that we've had in the cupboard, sort of skeletons in the cupboard, and they haven't been dealt with. Which excavations were they? Well, they were done in the 1980s, they said. Now, I think the fact is that the way they came to me was the fact that I was the only person alive at Wessex who could actually remember going to those excavations. And I did too. And of course I am a resident of the city, so I said, yeah, I'll do it. Well, once I got over the basic of the text of the trench descriptions and all the rest of it, I wanted to expand and find out, trying to put each of those sites into some sort of context. And of course, there are some other cities, Winchester, York, Exeter, where there's been quite a big tradition in doing archaeology. When I started to look at Salisbury, it was not very much. Now then, here we have probably the first series of excavations that were ever done in the city. And they were done by the Salisbury Museum Archaeological Rescue Group at Smard. And you'll notice that they are clustered on the east side of the city. That is not because there was a convenient cafe to hand. It was because at the time it was where the inner ring road, the dual carriageway, passed through the city. And you can see there are the approximate lines of the city ramparts that you can see. It's just where it creeps into the city. And it was an opportunity that provided an incredible archive of material, the only time that we've been able to actually excavate the ramparts or the traces of the ramparts in the city. It was an incredibly valuable piece of work. We then move on to the 1980s, which after a sort of a hiatus in archaeological fieldwork. And you can see, sort of in the centre there, 4 blue dots. They are in the Trinity checker, and they were the ones that were principally my backlog that I actually had to write up. And so we shall be looking at them a little later on. Since the 1980s, moving on, look at that. Now we're into a situation where we've got archaeological fieldwork being done as a condition of planning consent. And the title of a book that I've written, here's a bit of gratuitous advertising right from the word go, is called Joining the Dots. And it is about the archaeology of Salisbury. Hence, joining the dots. You can see there are umpteen dots. A lot of those pieces of work are not major excavations. Some of them are, first cock up of the day, folks. People would say, Salisbury, you've got so many wonderful medieval buildings. We have done. And you'll be able to see, I've no doubt, some of those on Sunday when you do the perambulation of the city. But when you look at somewhere like the 2 checkers that I've highlighted on that thing, you can actually see that actually a lot of I've only marked out the buildings up to the 18th century. A lot of the medieval buildings are only represented in those parts of the city by the archaeology. So in other words, if we don't dig for it, we ain't going to find very much about the past structure of the city in the medieval times. Like I say, so much of this was done in small trenches. Here, for example, on the left, we have a little hole in Brown Street which revealed 2 chalk-lined medieval cesspits. And then on the right in the Guildhall Square, if there's a hole, go and have a look down it. You never know what you might find. And I think you'll find that in that trench there, we're probably the only visual remains of the council house that has ever been seen in the city. One of the great administrative buildings of the medieval Salisbury. There were some amazing foundations found in there. I think you saw them, didn't you, Phil? Yes, he's nodding sagely. So you never know. It doesn't have to be a major excavation. It can be quite a small excavation. Now, one of the problems we have in Salisbury is that you can certainly appreciate it on the one in Brown Street, is the lack of decent stratigraphy. And that is actually quite good. You see there we've got a medieval pit overlain by some medieval floors. No doubt Lorraine will be telling us later on that we have one of the problems with dating phases of activity in the city is the lack of carefully stratified large pottery assemblages. She's nodding sagely already. And this has always been one of the crucial things that makes digging in Salisbury a little bit difficult. This is by far and away the norm. But throughout the city, one of the things that you do get is a very consistent pattern of behaviour across the city. At the bottom, we have the river alluvium. You've got to remember that most of the city and the close was founded on the Avon floodplain. It got wet. And so what you have to do is you make it up. And throughout the city you find that you've got medieval make-up levels, and then on the top of that you have your medieval levels, and then on the top of that more modern make-up and demolition rubble, which in a lot of cases have truncated the medieval foundations, the very bits that you're interested in. So there is a difficulty with working in the city. So once we got all that out of the way, I then decided, well, what we really needed to do was to actually see what we could do pictorially. And one of the best pictures, if you like, of the city was this one by William Nash in 1716. I've looked at that map for the last 2 or 3 years. I've looked at it in considerable detail. And, of course, in 1716, sorry Alex, am I in the way? In 1716, he was surveying most of a city that hadn't altered since the medieval period. We're getting into a point where bricks are coming in, and some of the 18th century brick buildings might have started off. But my contention is that that is primarily a medieval city. And when I looked at it, I noticed that he actually shows the city in 2 different ways. I've highlighted the red ones here, and those are the buildings which have got courtyard structures and long ranges going back perpendicular to the street frontages. And you can see they are arranged around the market square, and then going up to the north along Castle Street and into the east and to the west through to Wilton and Winchester, and then also extending down into High Street in towards the Close. The tenements, or the chequers around that, are just depicted as sort of almost terrace structures. And I wondered whether or not we could show in the archaeology that what he was surveying was a fairly accurate depiction of the medieval city. So the first thing I had to do was check what I knew. Now, how many people here are Salisbury residents? A fair smattering. The Salisbury residents will know where the Red Lion Hotel is. And it is a fairly distinctive building. It is there. And what you will know when you walk in there is that there is a courtyard building with a cross range at the back. You will see that Nash does not show that cross range. And I began to think, well, he's not very good then, is he? So then I started to have a look at other places, and I looked at the gaps in the terraces. And there's a gap in the terrace in Rolleston Street, and we've dug trenches there, and there are no buildings there. Got that one right. Same thing there, no buildings. He got that one right. And another one down there in Ivy Street, he got that one right. So I began to have a little bit more confidence about relying on Nash and what he was actually depicting. Now, as I've said, most of the work that we've done, it oftentimes very small excavations. So what I'm going to do now is highlight some of the bigger ones and focus in on them. Here's the first one of our 1980s excavations, and then out in the far-flung corners of the city, nice contrast in the northeast corner, the Vanner's Checker, and then a bit more central, the bus station. Now, if we then start off with Brown Street, there it is in the Trinity Checker, and that's what we would have seen then in the 1980s, early 1980s. The thing that I love about that photograph is that if you look at the top of the spire, you can see that it's got the platform, which was marked the beginning of the restoration of the cathedral. And of course, if you go and look at the cathedral now, the east front of the cathedral has still got scaffolding. It is quite an amazing piece of civil engineering. But that, I always remember them putting that up. And of course, in the 1980s, that was when the big hurricane struck Britain. And you can imagine the poor old spire was really waving around with that big lump of scaffolding on the top. But it's still up there. That's what you see now. And funnily enough, if you look at that photograph here, that's the edge of the trench. It just goes to show that Salisbury City Council have not resurfaced the car park. But what I did find fascinating as I was going through the archive was that actually in the 1980s the excavation was doing so much of the things that we do now in archaeology and encouraging, in this case, schools, things like that. I just can't help wondering, those little nippers there, they probably should have toe boards there put up and say high-vis jackets and all the rest of it in modern Parliament. But for them it must have been an quite incredible experience to come and have a look at that excavation. I wonder what memories they got of that. And also, in the foreground, yes folks, that is a real life donkey jacket. So, if we look at the actual trench itself, what we find is that, firstly, we have along the east side, the central axis of the checker. And in this instance, it is marked by the town ditch. The town ditch was one of two major culverts. There was a whole series of water channels running through Salisbury at the time, but there were two really big ones. The town ditch, with which that is a sample, that's the only place, to my knowledge, that the town ditch has ever been excavated, and then, even then, they did not get to the bottom of it. And the other major equivalent ditch is the close ditch, which ran around the close and literally made a moat, if you like, around the close. So that was a source, or supposedly a source of fresh water. It was also a very suitable place to dump all your sewage. So it was a pretty rancid affair, in my opinion, and I think in everybody else's. But then we've also got a series of divisions running east to west, which divide that site into 3 component parts. And for those who don't know, Salisbury is based around a grid checkerboard pattern. Each checker was subdivided into individual tenements, and the tenements were divided or measured 7 by 3 perches, which is about equivalent to 35 by 15 metres. And so here we've got at the top 47, 49 and 51 Brown Street, each about 5 metres across. So what we're looking there at is probably subdivisions of one of the complete tenements. What we also see is that we have a consistent backline to the buildings, and obviously we could never see the front because it's probably equal to where the modern street frontage is. But you will see that from that blue line here, that way, invariably marries up to about 5.7 metres wide. That's the one on the left is in Castle Street. The one on the right here, as you can see, is the Wigan Quill. I've measured umpteen times, been around with a tape measure. That is a consistent measurement throughout the city, and I think it's not just the measurements of the checkers that are consistent, but also the frontages of the houses. You also find that in some instances we've got a central hearth. Opinion seems to be divided as to whether or not these early buildings, and we're talking sort of 13th, 14th century, were single story or 2-story. There are certainly 14th century buildings still in the city which have 2 stories which are jettied, so they certainly did have the ability to do that. But then by about the 15th or 16th century, you find that they're moving the hearth into the angle between the through passage, the cross passage, and the street frontage. And I believe that the chimney stack on this building here would have been very, very much more similar. I think it would have been quite a familiar sight in Salisbury, not with the chimney coming out through the ridge line, but actually coming out through the frontage of the buildings. There were 4 conjoined buildings in Diggin Street on the other side of Brown Street that all had a fireplace in the angle there, and I'm sure that's, and I think it's the obvious way to get the chimney out of a timber frame building without trying to encourage any form of fire risk. That's my version of it anyway. At the back you may get service ranges. Some of them must have had service ranges. They did have service ranges of varying sizes. And then towards the back, we have various outhouses. 560 and 574 are both small hearths. So these buildings could have been kitchens, workshops, all manner of things. And I think what the beauty of this form of excavation is that it does actually push the emphasis into the backlands as well as onto the frontages. So often the archaeology has gone through looking at the street frontage without necessarily considering what's going on in the backlands. And here we have, like I say, outhouses, structures and what have you, pigsties maybe, gardens. The backlands of the city were as important then as our gardens are nowadays and what we do with them. So that's one of the models here. If we then go on to up into the northeast corner, Bedouin Street, Sword Lane, you can see myself there supervising. It's a typical pose, not doing any work, just admiring the general scene, and that's more or less what it is for those of you who know Salt Lane now. That's how what we see. When we look at that site, you can see we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 separate trenches. Those trenches are put there because that's where they're going to put the houses. So we don't strip out the whole lot, we have to dig where they're going to put the houses. But we get the same sort of arrangement. In here we've got the main division in the main division in the checker. In this case, running east to west, and then we have a tenement checker there, a tenement division there, and then, as everywhere else, we have a consistent back line to the on-street accommodation. In this part of Salt Lane, actually, the modern street frontage has been pushed back a bit, so that the medieval is probably going to be somewhere down here somewhere. You can see it's just a bit of a can here. So that would have been somewhat wider. We then also have another little outhouse. I think some of these little outhouses must have been probably made out of cob construction. Very reasonable form of material in the city. And then we begin to see other things in here. Wells, which of course would have been a primary source of water. And just as one has to take liquids in, we have to let liquids go out, and so we need cesspits. And as we saw in the Brown Street example, they can crop up anywhere, and they quite often, they're stuck at the bottom of the garden, which is probably where you'd expect them to be, very close to the main tenement boundary. You will also see in this image a few pits, particularly up near the cesspit at the top. Salisbury is noted for not having very many rubbish pits, but actually when you start looking around, there's actually slightly more than you might think there are. And I think that particular group there we were lucky in getting a very tightly grouped late medieval pottery assemblage, which was very, very useful. Down by the well, there's also some hefty pits. One there and one there. They're interesting because what we think they are was extraction pits for the brick earth. In this site here, we are just on the slightly rising ground at the base of Milford Hill. We are not on the floodplain. And we've got here this sort of sandy brick earth, which makes ideal material for floors and for wattle and daub. And they seem to have been quarrying it on this site before the accommodation was put up. This part of the city lagged behind everywhere else. We were probably looking at 15th or 16th century for the first buildings. In other words, the housing was spreading out from the city centre into the periphery of the city. And finally, we come to the bus station. Probably familiar to many of you, queued up for getting on the bus to somewhere or another, going home or what have you. And here we have it, right at the end. When we did have a bus station, our buses weren't parked out on the streets like they are now, bless them. And then on the right here, the view you would have seen up to 1939, and you've got the Woolpack Inn, which became the accommodation building for the bus station, and next door to it in the middle, mid-18th century brick building. And what's nice about this site here was it really only got three phases: bus station, this one, and everything else before that. And everything else before that is going to be the medieval period, and the only way we can actually look for that is through the archaeology. And so in the top image there you can see the outline of the excavated area, and you will see that on the east side we have the bit that is very reminiscent, representative of Nash's what I call terrace type mapping, and then on the left hand side one of his what looks like a courtyard building. Now this gives us an opportunity to kind of compare and contrast those cityscapes in that part of the chequer. So moving down to the plan, you see that really it looks a bit of a mishmash up to a point, but if I start drawing some lines on it, I hope you'll see there's a bit of sanity. Let's start off with this one. That's the one that runs through the middle, and you can see it divides equally the east side from the west side. And then we can start putting in some cross ones, one through there, and probably one through about there. And bearing in mind that we have got some instances where a tenement was divided into or subdivided, we might be able to conjecture that and that. And basically speaking, when you look at the dimensions, you've got 4 standard chequers, 35 by 15 metres, and the one, as I say, on Rolleston Street's potentially subdivided into 3 subdivisions. If we look at then, go on to the Rolleston side, you can see there how I've divided those up, and we've now got the back line again, 5.7 from the street frontage, same old pattern. But what we can do here is drop in 3 buildings there, which fit in quite nicely. That is a plan taken from the Royal Commission of Historic Monuments survey. You can see that it's exactly the same pattern as we saw in Brown Street, with accommodation and a through passage that will allow you into access to the backlands. And if you want to know where that plan is, idyllically and fortuitously, it's a pub. And God moves in mysterious ways, his wonders to perform. The fact is, you can go to the pub and argue that you're doing it as archaeological fieldwork research. And you can see there exactly how that configuration of 3 conjoining cottages takes place through passages. And when you go into the new inn, you can see how that is divided up. I think that that building is probably quite representative of the sort of cityscape that you would have seen in those terraces, and I think it's one of those things that would have been quite a repeating pattern. If we go over to the other side, we see a slightly different arrangement, because all of a sudden, we've got a pretty hefty building actually in the centre of the chequer, and we can put the other one in there. And you will see now that that one is perpendicular to the street frontage. The other thing which is interesting about both of those buildings is that the dimensions are 2:1. And again, I'm sick and fed up with going through the city, pacing off the dimensions of buildings to find out whether they're 2:1 arrangements. Here are 2 of the more typical ones. Trust me, they are 2:1, and they're both perpendicular to the street frontage. And so I think that if we went back Here is Endless Street as it stands now. This is the stretch that goes from what was the bus station. I think if we went back there in the medieval period, we would expect to see something a bit like that. I borrowed that from the centre of the city, but I think that that's the kind of model that would give me an idea of how those buildings would have been. So there we go.